As we speak, President Lee Jae-myung and Singaporean Prime Minister Lawrence Wong are holding their summit talks in Singapore. Following the meeting, the two leaders are expected to witness the signing of several memorandums of understanding before delivering a joint press statement on the outcomes of today's discussions. We will bring you these significant moments live, so do stay tuned. Now, to give you some background, the latest sit-down marks President Lee's second summit with Prime Minister Wong since taking office, and today's talks are widely seen as a pivotal moment in advancing bilateral cooperation in future-oriented industries. Now, at the top of the agenda is artificial intelligence. Both governments are looking to expand collaboration in AI, digital innovation, and sciences and technology. Around 5 MOUs are expected to be signed, covering AI cooperation, small modular reactors, and broader next-generation sectors. Trade is also high on the agenda, and the leaders are expected to agree to launch negotiations to upgrade the existing free trade deal between the two countries. If confirmed, that would signal a clear intention to modernize trade frameworks in line with emerging technologies and evolving supply chains. Now, artificial intelligence is also expected to be one of the defining themes of this latest visit. Singapore ranked first in the IMF's 2024 AI Preparedness Index, underscoring its leadership in digital infrastructure and policy readiness. And by deepening cooperation with one of Asia's leading AI hubs, South Korea aims to strengthen its own technological competitiveness and expand collaboration between industry and research institutions. And beyond the policy agenda, this visit also carries important ceremonial weight, of course. Now, to help me break down what we're watching to unfold there in Singapore, we are joined in the studio by Mason Rishi, Professor of International Politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Professor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great. Nice to be here. Thank you.
So, I want to talk with the bigger picture first. President Lee, he has now launched his ASEAN diplomacy in earnest. How significant do you think his visit to Singapore in terms of a broader foreign policy strategy?
So obviously, Lee Jae-myung, like his predecessors Yoon Suk-yeol and also Moon Jae-in, wants to diversify partners, especially economically. And Singapore is a good fit for that, a great fit for that, of course, within ASEAN and within Southeast Asia more generally. And of course, this is one stop on his swing through Southeast Asia. Lee will then continue on to the Philippines, which is also a burgeoning and important state in Southeast Asia. The background for this, I think, are a number of different things. First of all, there's just a trend towards this type of economic diversification by middle powers all over the world, including here, South Korea. Also, the background for that, among other things, being U.S.-China rivalry and middle and small powers wanting to find a way to sort of navigate between some of the tensions between Washington and China and the way that they play out in terms of either of those countries sort of trying to force choices on states. They're trying to diversify those connections with other states so they don't have to make some of those difficult choices. Obviously, we have, as you just mentioned in the news program, the Iran war, which of course is destabilizing regionally, notably of course in a place that produces a lot of petroleum, which is important for a petroleum poor country such as South Korea. So again, the sort of larger instability globally in terms of peace and security, whether it be Iran or the war in Ukraine. And we've seen all kinds of middle powers, including South Korea, as I mentioned, over the last decade at least, engage in this type of effort to diversify their economic relations. South Korea is doing it with Canada. We just saw last week with the summit here with Brazil, another middle power, Japan, and so now it's sort of Southeast Asia's turn, I guess, within Lee's larger diplomatic outlook. So, how significant of this? It's important, but I would say moderately so, right? There's no replacing the United States. There's no replacing China. An enhanced strategic partnership with Singapore is important, but it's not going to be a game changer. I guess the last thing I would throw out in terms of that sort of diplomatic issue is, of course, we should remember June of 2018 was the Singapore summit between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, and I can't help but think that somehow or other Lee Jae-myung would like to see perhaps a redux of that. I don't think it's in the cards necessarily, but certainly that role that Singapore played in facilitating that meeting, I think obviously has made Singapore even more on the map for South Korea than it might otherwise have been.
Right, definitely a very important player indeed. Now, as the leaders are expected to launch negotiations to upgrade their existing free trade agreement, how significant would the agreement be in practical terms, Professor, especially given the rapid evolution of digital trade and emerging technologies lately?
Yeah, again, so I think important, but moderately so. The trade volume between Singapore and South Korea is roughly $55 billion annually, with South Korea having a small surplus of, I think, $1.5 or $2 billion. So again, it's a meaningful partner country, but not one that's going to dramatically change economic fortunes for South Korea one way or another, at least in the sort of current way of looking at things. South Korea exports to Singapore integrated circuits, ships, that's an important part of it. Also petroleum products, and which South Korea imports the petroleum here or the gas here, and then converts those into finished products, which are then sent to places that need those types of industrial inputs into their own economy. Singapore being one of them. Singapore is also a supplier of some integrated circuits that go into Korea's consumer electronics and into its supply chain, so it matters in that regard. Singapore also is an export hub to South Korea for plastics, electronics, and even also some chip-making equipment, which is therefore also important for South Korea. Beyond the sort of trade part of the story, there's also the investment part of it, and Singapore is a trade hub. It's an investment hub in Southeast Asia, so not only for Singapore and for Singaporean countries, but also for other countries in ASEAN who like the political stability there, who like the regulatory environment there. So it's a really important hub for any country that wants to try to have its businesses do business in Southeast Asia. I think the big question really going forward is not so much the trade volume or even the investment part of the equation, but it's really these frontier tech areas, and obviously that's going to be significantly on the agenda here. You mentioned it with respect to AI. And so we'll see, how that plays out. South Korea Singapore is an important place for AI regulation, AI governance. It's a data hub, again, also for Southeast Asia. It's also an important player in the world of robotics and increasingly in digital services, intellectual property rights, small modular nuclear reactors, and that type of thing. So how South Korea under Lee and Wong sets the stage for the development of these areas, I think will probably tell us more, or at least potentially be more impactful than the sort of traditional trade volume and investment volume issues.
Right, and especially South Korea and Singapore are both two countries that have a lot of strength when it comes to economic aspects. When we look at the structure, economic structure of both countries, Professor, where do you see the strongest areas of synergy when we collaborate with Singapore?
Yeah, so again, to go back to a part of the equation, I think it involves investment diversification. Singapore has certain areas, where it wants to invest, so it's not overly invested in certain sectors and in certain types of businesses and in certain states. And the same thing is true of South Korea, right? South Korean businesses want to be invested in certain areas that are important for them, but they don't want to be overly invested either. So they can be each sort of provide some diversification in their investment efforts. As I mentioned, also Singapore is an important data hub. Data is obviously critical for the development of artificial intelligence. So that data hub and the regulatory environment and the governance environment of data and how that feeds into AI is an important place where Singapore has something to offer. Singapore has excellent science and technology bases, both in the private sector and in universities and research institutes. So they're also in the areas of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics, again, which are also areas where South Korea has strengths. There's potential, complementarity, or at least, ways in which they can cooperate for value added. Singapore is a growing investor and a growing part of the space launch ecosystem, which is, of course, being increasingly privatized. and as I mentioned, also small modular reactors. Singapore is a city-state. It's not particularly large. It doesn't have space for huge amounts of solar or for huge amounts of hydro or large sort of traditional bespoke nuclear reactors. So the energy security for a country like Singapore is perhaps somewhat more fragile than it would be for larger states. And insofar as South Korea is trying to be, and in some sense succeeding in being on the leading edge of some of the development and rollout of small modular reactors, that's the type of energy input that could provide an extra form of energy security for a country like Singapore, which matters, of course. As I mentioned, also. Shipping, South Korea is of course a major shipping constructor, and Singapore is one of the world's most important ports and is an important hub for the global shipping industry as a major port, and even agriculture. I was in Singapore years ago. This was I think pre-COVID, and it was interesting. All over the buses in the city and even in some of the metros, there you saw advertisements for South Korean strawberries. Which I thought was kind of interesting, and it made me a bit puzzled as to why Singapore would need or would want to import strawberries from South Korea, but they did. And indeed, I'm expecting some things to come out of this meeting between Lee and Wong dealing with sustainable farming and sustainable agriculture.
Right. It really seems cooperation in the agriculture is also expanding. Now, let me circle back to artificial intelligence again, Professor. So, of course, artificial intelligence is one of the key items on the agenda for cooperation. I wonder, how do the strengths of the two countries actually complement each other in these emerging sectors?
Yeah, so, one of the things, of course, is that, South Korea is a major chip maker. And so the semiconductors, the integrated circuits that South Korea produces, notably on the cutting edge in areas such as high bandwidth memory, feed into the AI ecosystem in terms of putting together these GPUs that allow the training of the AI models, and in that sense, it's a very important part of that overall ecosystem, which Singapore, as a very high-tech country with a huge amount of investment in data and highly digitalized economy, and also as a nimble economy, also wants to find niches in this larger growing AI ecosystem. Obviously means that Singapore is an increasing destination for the expertise and the excellence that South Korea has in that part of it. Obviously, the flip side of it is you can't do anything really with artificial intelligence without having the data to train it. And as I mentioned, Singapore is an important data hub in Southeast Asia. On a government level, an administrative level, on a business level, research and development level. It's an important part of that. It's a stable country. It's a well-governed country. And in that sense, it's an important data hub, and that data feeds into these AI models. And so that's a way in which I think that we can see Singapore not only for itself, but also as a gateway to Southeast Asia being an important part of this sort of AI side of the equation. And so that's important. Then you have the robotics dimension, where again, also in some cases, AI feeds into it, as AI helps the robots in manufacturing and other processes function more efficiently, and in some cases more autonomously. And then, as I mentioned, also another sort of frontier tech are these small modular reactors, where South Korea is on the leading edge of trying to develop those and roll those out commercially, and Singapore would be almost certainly a country that would want to have uptake of these types of small modular reactors for its own economic security and energy security.
So we're seeing AI really take a large portion of this latest visit, and we're also expected to see President Lee taking part in the AI Connect Summit himself, reinforcing what some are calling his AI diplomacy. For starters, Professor, could you explain for us what is this term actually about AI diplomacy?
Well, AI diplomacy is a fancy way of saying that Lee is out there trying to facilitate Korean businesses' entry into marketplaces and to essentially use the sort of stamp of the president to say, we as a country, South Korea, are behind this economic sector. And we're there not only to help our own businesses, find their way into other marketplaces, but also we're supporting them once they're doing so, and that you're not just buying or entering into a relationship with a private sector business. You're entering into a relationship that has some sustainability behind it and has the power of the state behind it, and not just businesses themselves. And so this AI Connect Summit, that's a business-to-business forum where businesses try to facilitate through meeting each other where it is that they can provide value added to each other. And so, in a sense, that's sort of classic middle power president role, is to go to these types of summits and sort of wave the flag and talk about how important this particular sector of the economy is for it, which in this case is also true, and in some sense sort of ease the mind of potential investors in these countries, or ease the minds of potential companies that would enter into partnership with Korean businesses, notably of course in smaller sectors like small and medium-sized enterprises, which may not have the name recognition of Samsung or an SK or these other larger companies. And so that it sort of facilitates how some of these small and medium-sized enterprises notably can enter into marketplaces where they might otherwise having a bit of a harder time getting access.
Right, so it's like a show of interest and willingness in the national level in the area. Then, Professor, in your view, what kind of strategic message does President Lee's personally taking part in this AI Connect Summit actually send, both economically and diplomatically?
Yeah, I mean, anytime the president gets involved with anything, it means that it matters. Whether or not this is truly strategically important for South Korea, this particular AI Connect meeting, I have some doubts. He's serving as a facilitator. My guess is, no offense to Ijeong, but the president of South Korea, a country of which I'm not a citizen, but my guess is his knowledge of AI is probably limited. So he's not there to sell products. He's not there to show his particular knowledge of these types of issues in any deep way. He's there to say, at least as long as I am the president, we're going to be behind our businesses. And so, whether that's a large global icon like Samsung or SK, or whether that's an up-and-coming startup in a startup ecosystem here, or an established small and medium-sized enterprise that might be trying to grow a little bit into a different area, he's there to say, our country is here through regulatory frameworks, through trying to facilitate business connections, through making sure that credit availability is there and financing mechanisms, et cetera, that we're there to support our businesses because we think that they can do important things not only for us South Koreans and for South Korean businesses, but also for these other companies as well. A president's most important asset is his time or her time. And so by going to these types of summits, you're signaling simply by the expenditure of time that this area matters.
Definitely. For those of you who are just joining us, we are having a live special coverage of President Ijeong's and the Singaporean Prime Minister Lawrence Wong's summit, and we are going to look forward to a MOU signing ceremony which will be aired soon, which will be followed by a joint press briefing. We are still awaiting the footage, and before that we are having a discussion with Professor Mason Rishi from the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Professor, let's continue our discussion. So beyond the bilateral dimension, Singapore is seen widely as a financial and strategic hub in Southeast Asia, like you've mentioned a while ago. So in that sense, do you think the summit today could serve as a gateway for South Korea to broaden its engagement with the wider ASEAN region?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that's what Lee's counting on. The relationship between Singapore and South Korea is already a good one. They're going to try to, or not try, they're going to build on the partnership that they have and sort of take that partnership to a more strategic level. At least that's the outline of things. They're going to start renegotiating the free trade agreement to sort of update it and modernize it for the digital world that we find ourselves in. And of course, the idea is that Singapore is in some sense the place to start in Southeast Asia, because much of what happens in the rest of Southeast Asia, especially in the economic sphere, sort of flows downhill from the best practices of Singapore, whether that be in a country like Indonesia or Malaysia or Thailand or Vietnam or the Philippines, where Lee's going to be going next. The way in which Singapore sort of sets standards that other ASEAN states, viewed from an external perspective, one would hope, manage to get close to, matters a lot. So sort of getting things right with Singapore is important because it sort of allows the downhill flow into relationships with other states to have a certain standard by which you can kind of aim at. That's one of the important sort of norm setting and standard setting functions that Singapore has. So I think that's a part of the equation. Singapore, it also has, a historical role that I think is quite interesting globally. It has a certain amount of autonomy from lots of other powerful states. It's in a surprisingly complex region where you've obviously had a mixture of colonial and aggressive forces historically, whether that be China or whether that be Japan or whether that be the British. Historically, it's been an area that's been contested, and Singapore has sort of managed to navigate that. And even today, right, being stuck in some sense in between China on the one hand as an important partner and neighbor, as well as the U.S., also India, frankly, and being surrounded by larger, more populous states, Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia. Singapore has managed to navigate a pretty difficult environment. In that sense, I think, holds some interesting lessons for other medium and small powers that are trying to do the same thing in a very complex environment currently.
Right, you've mentioned Singapore. It's in a complex region, and its geographic location. Considering that, South Korea's relationships with other countries in the region, unlike them, ties between Seoul and Singapore have notably been stable with very few points of friction, I believe. So, Professor, how important is that kind of trust and predictability? What kind of role would that play in sustaining long-term cooperation between the two countries?
Well, it's obviously really important. Both, Singapore in particular, really, because of its size. I mean, it's a city-state. I think, memory serves, it's roughly a population of 6 million. It's a small country, and it really relies on extremely effective government, extremely effective administration of its state apparatus, as well as the sort of larger society there. Which is not to say, by the way, that it's democratic. It has a very complex, shall we say, relationship with democracy. But the point is, it has to in part survive and thrive off of a reputation for expertise, for rationality, for good governance. And the fact that it's been able to do so for so long has made it a trusted partner. And as long as Singapore manages to maintain and uphold that going forward, there's no reason for South Korea to believe that as a partner it might not be trustworthy. And one has to say that in a world right now where there are a lot of large powers out there acting in ways that seem perhaps less trustworthy than they used to be before, less loyal than they used to be before, even if a relationship with a trusted partner like Singapore isn't as important as any of those other countries, nonetheless, every stone that you lay on a path forward for your country is an important one. And Singapore, may be a small stone, but every stone that you're laying on this path forward in the relationship that you have with trusted partners is an important one. And so I don't see Singapore deviating from that path because it has an incentive to itself, continue to maintain that trustworthiness. That's part of the reason why you see what is, frankly speaking, a relatively draconian social order there. The authorities there, the governance in Singapore knows that its stability and its ability to thrive over time, really relies on a foundation of good governance and social order, and that those two things make Singapore stable and trusted in comparison to other places where that's, just to give you an example, a place like Thailand where that's not the case, even though Thailand has different advantages. Right?
Right. So we are aware that the two countries, Holland, Singapore, it has been enjoying diplomatic ties for more than 50 years, I believe. So how would you characterize the current state of relations between the two countries? Do you think we're looking at a primarily economic partnership or something that's more evolving into a strategic alignment?
So I myself have used the word strategic and strategic partnership in this discussion that we've been having for the last 15 or 20 minutes. Strategic partnerships, I think, have as a term become somewhat devalued over the last 5 to 10 years. It seems like now everybody's a strategic partner with everybody, and so in order for a strategic partnership to matter as much anymore, now it has to be raised to the level of a comprehensive strategic partnership or a global strategic partnership or a special strategic partnership or a gold star strategic partnership. So I'm aware, let's say, of the fact that this term might be undergoing some grade inflation, let's say. As a professor, this is something we have to worry about. Everybody gets an A, it seems like these days. So I just think we shouldn't oversell the relationship. It matters, obviously, and yes, it's a strategic partnership, but at the end of the day, it really ultimately relies on the economic dimension of things. And I think it's critical that South Korea and Singapore are trying to advance that. Notably in the face of a very complicated set of economic headwinds, whether that be China's predatory economic behavior or the United States' tariffs and predatory economic behavior. It's important, as I mentioned at the top of this program, to have small and medium powers working together, either bilaterally or in these mini-lateral groupings with 3, 4, 5, 6 other partners, to try to advance their interests in ways that navigate the complexities of, notably, of U.S.-China rivalry and the larger multilateral and multipolar instability that we see globally speaking. But at the end of the day, what really matters between South Korea and Singapore is this economic relationship, this economic partnership, and then whether or not the strategic dimension of that builds on top of that economic partnership, I think is an open question. And as I said, I think there's sort of two things where you can kind of look both forward and look backwards and see something perhaps more important than your average strategic partnership between two small or medium-sized powers. Is looking back, of course, the 2018 Singapore summit, where Singapore, precisely because of the sort of relationship that it has in between the U.S. and China and other countries, it played a sort of interesting neutral arbiter as a place where Trump and Kim Jong-un could meet in 2018 and have their summit. So that clearly was a very important part of the story of North Korea-South Korea relations. Under the presidency of Moon Jae-in, and clearly, Lee Jae-myung would be interested in some type of redux of that. I don't necessarily think it's going to happen, but I think that clearly that's something that they would want to talk about. And then secondly, all of these frontier technological changes that are taking place. And we have a lot of instability in the global economy right now for a lot of different reasons that I've gone over, but also simply the technological changes mean that the old way of doing business and the old trading relationships that we have are not perhaps obsolete, but they're being enriched or superseded or relativized and transformed through the changes that are happening in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics, space, and these other areas. So the economic partnership between South Korea and Singapore, which is there, as much as anything else in the sort of traditional trade area, it needs to grow. And if it does grow, then indeed that relationship might break beyond the bonds of the sort of traditional economic partnership and become strategically significant as well.
Mm-hmm. So we've touched upon the importance of economic partnership between the two countries, but we are living in a world of uncertainties lately, and considering this current evolving situation, what do you think is the most necessary factor that would help South Korea and Singapore continue its, close cooperation and diplomatic ties moving forward?
I mean, as with all of these things, as with all of these, relationships that states have between each other, there's the phase where, the ideas get uptake from each of their leaderships, and that's usually, again, in these types of small and medium-sized country relationships, in some form or another economic, which means that almost certainly the relationship is passing through the filter of business and what enterprises want. And so there's a part where, a part of the relationship as it grows or it transforms, where the ideas are taken up into each government and they say, okay, here are some priority areas where we can cooperate, here are some priority areas where we can do things together. And then you have these meetings where, in advance the agenda's been set, the memoranda of understanding have been drafted. You have the signature event and the signing ceremonies. And everyone toasts the glass of champagne or wine or soju or whatever, and everyone smiles and it looks great. Well, then after that you have the implementation process, and I think really that's where ultimately the rubber hits the road, to use the American idiom. What's important is, of course, thinking out the relationship and setting the larger parameters and the structural constraints and the structural opportunities by which that happens. That matters, but of course what happens really afterward is important, and that's that implementation, whether it be through the state, in the case now South Korea and Singapore pushing forward, or whether it be through businesses meeting their obligations and really going forward on the investments and on the trade relationships and the business partnerships that they set out, and that we find concretized in these memoranda of understanding. Mm-hmm.
Now, another thing that I missed out to mention a while ago is that the latest visit, it included an official an official traditional ceremony where it's called an orchid naming ceremony, a unique diplomatic custom in which newly cultivated orchid hybrids are named in the honor of distinguished guests. And of course, orchids are Singapore's national flower. The ceremony itself symbolizes friendship and partnership. Professor, how should we understand the role of these kinds of ceremonial gestures in the broader context of state visits?
They're a very normal part of it. Doing these types of public diplomacy gestures are a good, very cheap, soft power way to get a little bit of goodwill from your partners. It's a sort of cherry on the cake. By themselves, these things don't mean that much, but the symbolism of it matters, and we've seen 100 or 1,000 different instances of this within the last 10 or 15 years among leaders. We saw South Korea give President Trump a gold crown. We saw the Swiss give Donald Trump a gold bar. I guess gold matters in a lot of cases. We saw Yoon Suk-yeol, sing American Pie when he was at the White House, and that just made the Americans swoon and fall in love with him, at least for a little while. So these types of gestures are relatively cost-free, and they're great for reporting. Both the Singaporean, Prime Minister's office. And the South Korean presidential office, will obviously get to send out these great press releases that talk about the friendship, and all of these things are kind of cost-free, and they're a nice cherry on the cake. And in this case, the fact that it's the national flower and it symbolizes friendship, that dovetails well together. It's also not martial, right? It's not like when the U.S. president goes to Great Britain and troops the colors, which is a very sort of martial kind of thing, where the U.S. president participates in this inspection of troops and that sort of thing. So there's a sort of sense of kind of Shangri-La about the whole story. the thing that ran through my mind when I saw that he was going to, Lee Jae-myung was going to have a naming ceremony for an orchid in which he's a participant, and it actually made me sort of alternately a little bit think of North Korea, where I know at least Kim Il-sung and I believe also Kim Jong-il, if I remember correctly, both had flowers named after them. I assume I don't know if it's the mugunghwa. I don't know if it's the same flower. I don't know if it's the same flower or not. But in any event, they named flowers after themselves. They had these cultivars of their national flower that they named after themselves, and they would actually, I think, had different versions of them in different colors and different breeds and hybrids and whatever else. And here I think it's nice that Lee Jae-myung is having a flower named after him by someone else rather than having to name a flower after himself. It's a sign, I suppose, of cooperation between well-governed states and those like North Korea, where obviously you have a tyrant who even something as small as naming after a flower after himself turns into a big national issue.
Mm-hmm. So it really was a big sign of a friendly gesture in the national level. But, listening to the examples that you've just mentioned, Professor, this came to my mind. Then what about personal relations? Having these kinds of gestures, showing these kinds of gestures, definitely would help in, making personal relations between the two leaders also deeper and build the rapport between the two. Do you think that kind of deeper personal rapport would help in, diplomacy, in engaging in diplomacy moving forward?
Yeah, obviously the personal is the political. Leader-to-leader relationships matter. South Korea has a long history of learning that in various contexts, right? So, if you think back, for instance, to the relationship between Nam Yu-hyun and George Bush, it was famously not particularly good. We know that the Moon Jae-in-Donald Trump relationship was complicated. On the other hand, we know that Yoon Suk-yeol and Joe Biden got along very well, right? I talked just earlier about the famous moment where Yoon Suk-yeol sang American Pie and made himself beloved of the political class in Washington, D.C. So the personal is the political, and it really does help move things forward. As I said, one of the things that happens when a president puts his imprimatur on some type of project or relationship is to say, I'm willing to invest time in this. And of course, also, you're saying, I'm willing to approve of this relationship. And this sort of gives an extra gust of wind to the wings of whatever business relationship or defense relationship or cultural relationship it is that's at stake in between two countries. It really says to some degree you're willing to go out on a limb a little bit in terms of your trust in another leader, which is of course in very high demand and does not have much supply, right? Leaders tend not to trust each other at first sight. They tend to think that leaders of other states are competitive, that leaders of other states are generally trying to advance their interests. So,
Professor, excuse me, let me just get in. We are going to turn over to the live coverage of President Lee Jae-myung and the Singaporean Prime Minister Lawrence Wong's signing ceremony of the Memorandums of Understanding. We are looking at a live coverage from Singapore. Currently, they are getting ready. They're having their preparations to sign a couple of memorandums of understanding that are expected. Professor, we believe it's in various areas, right, in terms of AI and small modular reactors and digital cooperation we're expecting. What are you most looking forward to?
I'm really going to look to see, where they're going to be on the tech side of things. What it is that, if there's any detail in these memorandum of understanding, once we have an idea of them on what's going to happen in the AI space.
Right.
I think that's really the most important one.
Thank you for that, Professor. We're going to listen to the speeches by the presidents themselves in Singapore.
Prime Minister and Minister of Science and ICT of the Republic of Korea, and Dr. Tan See Leng, Minister in charge for Energy, Science and Technology of the Republic of Singapore, to exchange the MOU on Science and Technology Cooperation.
다음으로 과학기술 협력에 관한 양해각서 교환이 있겠습니다.
you, Excellencies.
감사합니다.
May I now invite Mr. Park Yoon-gyu, President of the National IT Industry Promotion Agency of the Republic of Korea, and Mr. Chan San, Chief Executive of the Home Team Science and Technology Agency of the Republic of Singapore, to exchange the MOU on cooperation in artificial intelligence and enabling digital technologies for public safety.
다음으로 공공안전 분야 인공지능 및 디지털 기술 협력에 관한 양해각서 교환이 있겠습니다.
Please exchange the documents.
문건을 교환해 주십시오.
Thank you, Excellencies.
감사합니다.
May I invite Mr. Kim Yong-san, Minister of Intellectual Property of the Republic of Korea, and Mr. Nicky Tan, Chairman of Intellectual Property Office of Singapore, to exchange the MOU and enhance cooperation in the field of intellectual property.
다음으로 지식재산 강화 협력 양해각서 교환이 있겠습니다.
Please exchange the documents.
문건을 교환해 주십시오.
Thank you, Excellencies.
감사합니다.
May I now invite His Excellency Hong Jin-wook, Ambassador of the Republic of Korea to Singapore, and Mr. Wong Kang-jet, Chief Executive Officer of the National Environment Agency of the Republic of Singapore, to exchange the extension of the MOU on space and geospatial information for environment and pollution issues.
다음으로 환경 위성 공동 활용을 위한 양해각서 교환이 있겠습니다.
Thank you, Excellencies.
감사합니다.
May I invite Mr. Jun Dae-wook, Acting President and Chief Executive Officer of the Korea Hydro and Nuclear Power, and Mr. Kwa Kok Kyung, Chief Executive of the Energy Market Authority of Singapore, to exchange the MOU on civil nuclear energy cooperation.
다음으로 SMR 협력에 관한 양해각서 교환이 있겠습니다.
Please exchange the documents.
문건을 교환해 주십시오.
Thank you, Excellencies.
감사합니다.
Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. We have come to the end of the exchange ceremony. We will now commence the joint press conference. You may wish to put on the headphones located on your seat for the English and Korean interpretation.
네, 귀빈 여러분, 이상으로 양해각서 교환식을 마치며 이제 공동 언론 발표를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 한영 동시통역 청취를 희망하시는 분들께서는 좌석 위에 놓여있는 헤드폰을 착용해 주시기 바랍니다.
May I now invite Prime Minister to deliver his remarks, please.
Your Excellency President Lee Jae-myung, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to President Lee and his delegation. President Lee, you were a gracious host when I visited South Korea in November last year, and I'm pleased to be able to return your warm hospitality so soon after on your first visit to Singapore as President. Last year, Singapore and South Korea celebrated 50 years of diplomatic ties, and we elevated our ties to a strategic partnership. In just 4 months, we have made considerable progress in implementing this strategic partnership. We had just an exchange of quite a number of MOUs earlier, and President Lee and I also reviewed the strong momentum in our meeting just now. Let me share some highlights. First, we are strengthening our trade and economic ties. Singapore's investments in Korea have more than doubled since 2020. Companies like PSA, Singapore Airlines, and CapitaLand are deepening collaborations with Korean partners across logistics, aviation, and real estate. Korea's investments in Singapore have also grown steadily. Leading firms like Hyundai, Lotte Group, and Hanwha Ocean are not only doing more here, but also using Singapore as a hub to access opportunities across Southeast Asia and beyond. This robust growth builds on the strong foundations laid by the Korea-Singapore FTA, which entered into force in 2006. Over the past 2 decades since then, the global trading landscape has evolved significantly, with greater emphasis on supply chain resilience, digital trade, and the green transition. And so President Yi and I agreed to upgrade our FTA to ensure it remains forward-looking, relevant, and beneficial to our businesses and workers. Second, we are partnering each other to advance our green ambitions. Securing sustainable and reliable sources of clean energy will be critical to both our countries. Singapore is studying the potential of nuclear energy as part of our longer-term energy mix, and we hope to learn from Korea's expertise and experience. We have commenced negotiations on a nuclear cooperation agreement, and I look forward to its swift conclusion. Third, we are working together at the frontier of technology. Our new MOUs will facilitate joint research and talent exchanges in areas like advanced manufacturing and other high-value sectors, ensuring we remain competitive and innovative. President Yi and I also agreed to deepen cooperation in artificial intelligence, or AI, and to work towards a bilateral framework for specific areas of AI collaboration. We will also work together on areas of common interest in the wider digital domain. And at the same time, our agencies will strengthen cybersecurity cooperation so that we can seize the opportunities of this digital age in a safe and trusted manner. Fourth, we are bringing our civil servants closer together. Later this year, Singapore will host the inaugural edition of the Singapura program, a bespoke program for South Korean senior officials to exchange experiences and best practices. Next year, we hope to start a broader civil service exchange program to promote two-way interactions and deeper institutional linkages. These initiatives will build stronger relationships between our policymakers and facilitate even closer collaboration in future. Finally, our people-to-people ties are flourishing. South Korea is a global cultural powerhouse. Singaporeans are avid fans of K-drama and K-pop, and many travel to Korea to experience your rich culture and heritage firsthand. The Korean band BTS is performing here at the end of the year, and I understand that Singapore is their longest stop in Asia outside South Korea and Japan, so we look forward to welcoming them. Singapore, of course, is much smaller than Korea, but I'm glad that interest is just as strong in the other direction. We welcome the many Korean visitors who come each year to Singapore, as well as the vibrant Korean community that lives, works, and studies here. They add to the richness and diversity of our society and strengthen the bonds between our people. Beyond bilateral ties, we are also working closely together to advance our shared interests in open trade, multilateralism, and digital connectivity, both regionally and through plurilateral frameworks like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, and the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, or DIPA. Singapore also looks forward to commencing negotiations to upgrade the ASEAN-Korea Free Trade Area. And as coordinator for ASEAN-Korea economic relations, we are committed to working with all parties to deliver a meaningful and substantial outcome. In an increasingly complex and dangerous world, trusted and like-minded partners matter more than ever. I am glad that Singapore can count the Republic of Korea as a valued and reliable partner. So, President Yi, I look forward to working closely with you to bring our strategic partnership to even greater heights in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. May I now invite His Excellency Ije명 to deliver his remarks, please.
감사합니다, 총리님. 이제 대한민국 이재명 대통령님의 말씀을 청해 듣겠습니다.
존경하는 Honorable Prime Minister Lawrence Wong and the people of Singapore,
이런 따뜻한 환영에
I'm very thankful for your warm welcome and to be here on behalf of the Korean people.
작년 11월 서울에
Just 4 months after our meeting in Seoul last November, and to hold this bilateral summit in Singapore is profoundly meaningful. The Republic of Korea and Singapore, over the past century, during the processes of nation building and modernization, have demonstrated the resilience to turn limited resources and geopolitical challenges into stepping stones for development, growing into exemplary middle powers. The Prime Minister and I shared the view that in navigating the challenges of the 21st century, an era of ultra uncertainty, our two countries can become trusted partners. Accordingly, building upon the strategic partnership elevated on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations last year, we have agreed to further deepen bilateral cooperation, while further strengthening the economic linkages that have driven. We have agreed to accelerate innovation in future high-tech sectors such as artificial intelligence and to reinforce the foundation for cooperation in defense and security. To this end, our two governments have issued 1 declaration and signed 5 memoranda of understanding. Moving forward, we will maintain even closer communication and implement these initiatives with speed and determination. Allow me to outline the key outcomes of today's summit. First, as countries that have led the regional free trade order, we have agreed to further strengthen economic solidarity, economic security cooperation, and strategic investment collaboration. To this end, we have agreed to launch negotiations to improve the Korea-Singapore FTA and have just signed a joint declaration. As we mark the 20th anniversary of the FTA's entry into force this year, we have agreed to upgrade the agreement so that it fully reflects changes in the trade and economic security environment as well as technological advancements. We have also agreed to pursue closer investment cooperation in a more strategic manner. The investment partnership MOU signed between the Korea Development Bank and Seviora, the asset management group of Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund, we will lead this investment cooperation. As investment increases in Korea's promising small and medium-sized enterprises and emerging industries, the shared growth of our two countries will become even more robust. We have also agreed to conclude a Smart Farm Cooperation MOU at an early date and to expand cooperation for sustainable agricultural development based on advanced technologies and for strengthening food security. Second, we have agreed to expand comprehensive cooperation in high technology and energy security. To deepen AI cooperation, we will pursue the conclusion of an AI cooperation framework which will help secure momentum for collaboration, including industrial innovation based on physical AI and expanded research and investment in real-world AI applications. I expect that the AI capabilities and innovative industrial ecosystem of Korea and Singapore will generate synergy and further accelerate AI development in the region. In addition, through the MOU on cooperation in AI and digital technology in the public safety sector and the MOU on strengthening intellectual property cooperation signed today, cooperation between our two countries to enhance AI utilization capabilities in public safety and administrative services will further strengthen. This will serve as an important stepping stone toward realizing our shared vision of AI for all. We have also signed the Science and Technology Cooperation MOU to strengthen cooperation in quantum computing, space and satellite technologies, on Environment Satellite Joint Utilization MOU to share and verify environmental satellite data for quality research, and an SMR Cooperation MOU to jointly develop small modular reactor business models and share related information. Building on today's achievements, I hope to further further solidify our existing cooperation in trade, investment, and infrastructure while expanding the horizon of bilateral cooperation into promising future sectors like AI, nuclear power, and advanced science and technology. Third, we have agreed to further expand cooperation in the security sector and to continue cooperation for regional peace and stability. We have agreed to expand ongoing joint research in defense and technologies, to continue discussions on strengthening defense capabilities based on advanced technologies. We will also further strengthen coordination in responding to transnational crimes such as online scams and cyber threats. The Republic of Korea will actively support Singapore in its role as ASEAN chair next year. In addition, we will work with Singapore to further elaborate and fully implement the CSP vision proclaimed last year's Korea-ASEAN Summit to serve as a contributor that fulfills dreams and hopes, a springboard for growth and innovation, and a partner for space and stability. Singapore is a meaningful venue where the historic North Korea-US Summit was held in 2018. I express my deep appreciation to the Prime Minister for his strong support for our government's efforts toward peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula and the resumption of the Korean dialogue. 8 years ago, Singapore demonstrated outstanding diplomatic leadership through dialogue and communication in the pursuit of peace. I trust that Singapore will continue to play a constructive role for peace on the Korean Peninsula and in the region. During today's summit, the Prime Minister and I also discussed the recent situation in the Middle East. We assessed its impact on global security, energy supply chains, and the global economy. And we also shared the view that stability and peace in the Middle East should be restored. Moreover, I'm confident that this visit will further strengthen the friendship and trust between our two countries and also deepen our strategic partnership. Once again, I extend my sincere gratitude to the government and people of Singapore for the warm hospitality extended to me and our delegation. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellencies. Ladies and
Now that marked the end of our live coverage of the President's joint briefing with the Singaporean Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, and it ended with one joint declaration and 5 MOUs, I believe. Professor Rishi, how would you assess the results of the overall outcome?
Pretty much what we expected, which isn't a bad thing. When you have these summits, they're scripted in advance. The MOUs are already written. Everything's more or less supposed to go as the script decides, which I think was clearly the case here. And I think that's a great sign for Ijeong, right? Singapore is not the world's most important place, but every little step counts. Every strategic partnership matters at least a little bit. And here I think he can say, okay, he books a win, right? He got a lot of technical things done, which I think were important, and he's sort of showing that he's a competent diplomat. On the sort of specifics, this AI on public safety and law enforcement, I'm actually not quite sure what that means. I'll be interested to see what that looks like going forward. I made some notes, the space and geospatial cooperation for the environment, notably on air quality. As someone who lives in South Korea and experiences the occasional bad air quality, and Singapore, which also has that problem, I hope that they're able to figure out some solutions to that. One of the things, I think maybe arguably the most important thing, or the most interesting perhaps for me, was this MOU on civil nuclear energy cooperation, which both leaders talked about, and Ijeong even in more specificity talking about small modular reactors. I think that's really important. And then, science and technology cooperation, how it is that they move that going forward, I think matters a lot. These MOUs seem like they were kind of technical, but I will say they did seem like there was a lot of coherence there. where you had data, digital, intellectual property rights, and all of that being backed up by energy, which is necessary to feed into the training for the AI, science and technology. It all fits together. The investments, facilitating small and medium-sized enterprises being involved in this ecosystem, the larger context of the intent to update their FTA. And then, of course, the two things geopolitically, I think, that came out of it that were interesting were, a direct mention by Lee Jae-myung of the Singapore summit 8 years ago. We're coming up on the 8-year anniversary in June 12th of this year. It's hard to believe it's been that long. And then the Middle East, of course. And so there, obviously, you see how the geopolitics are in the background.
Mm-hmm. So from AI to trade and also cooperation in the defense area, so a lot of agreements we're waiting for that. But for them to move beyond just symbolism and actually become concrete, bring concrete results, what immediate follow-up steps do you think would be necessary?
Yeah, so sort of following up on this, there's certain things that really it's the private sector that's going to have to handle, right? I mean, you set out the framework, you set out the MOUs, you get the government to provide, whatever administrative assistance is necessary to make things happen. But at the end of the day, the government, especially here in South Korea, doesn't direct where investment goes, right? That's primarily the job of companies. Well, outside of the U.S.-South Korea relationship, but and here I think companies here they're going to have to show their willingness to get involved, right? They're going to have to see where profit can be made, where value can be added, and how that can take place in the relationship with Singapore. So obviously the private sector has to get involved there. I think areas where we can really see, I think the governments follow up with the implementation on this are just 3 areas that came right into my head right now. The first of which is cybersecurity, which the Singaporean Prime Minister mentioned. That's something where both countries, South Korea and Singapore, heavily digitalized, heavily online, heavy tech investment. Cybersecurity, best practices, cybersecurity exercise training, exchange of cybersecurity expertise, like setting up something regular, maybe at this whole defense dialogue or in other contexts going forward, I think could be really useful that the government could do. Secondly, university talent exchange. Both of them talked about that, notably in science and tech. Make it easy for people in Singapore to get visas to come to Korea and the reverse. Make it easy for researchers and faculty and students who are in Korea to go to Singapore. Make that as seamless as possible. Both countries have great administrative capacity, and so I think that's a place where you can look. And then again, these small modular reactors. I mean, obviously, businesses, Doosan Interoperability here in Korea, just giving an example, businesses are ultimately the ones driving this forward, but research funding comes in some cases from the government. I assume that's probably also the case in Korea as well. And of course, ultimately, because you're dealing with something as sensitive as nuclear technology, a lot of government regulatory hurdles have to be taken out of the way in order for the cooperation to take place, especially if you're talking about nuclear cooperation across borders. So I think that's an area where I'd like to see the Korean and Singaporean governments move rapidly to implement what they've put together here, at least in principle.
Right, so some structural and systematic changes would be necessary moving forward. Professor Rishi, thank you so much for your insights and for your time tonight. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to be here.